All right. I'm going to turn the volume down. So virtue ethics. Uh, Virtue ethics is a view which has a lot of has been advocated at least since Aristotle, maybe before Aristotle. Uh, I would say that virtue ethics has kind of in some ways a lot of appeal. And the basic idea is that we should aim to be good people. We should aim to have good characters. And uh, while other moral views take the view that we should focus on which actions to perform, virtue ethics says what's important is being a good person. And if you're a good person, then your actions will flow from your character. So what the virtue ethics says what's important is to be uh, a good person and not kind of worry about the particular calculus of particular actions. But once you have the right character, then you'll be doing the right sorts of things. So the whole focus should be on what kind of person are you? Uh, Now, this view has been especially associated with the philosopher Aristotle, and you'll definitely be hearing a bit about Aristotle here. I'm not asking you to read any Aristotle. He wrote about his virtue ethics mainly in his book called The Nicomachean Ethics. Uh, And it's a big book. If certainly if you're doing kind of more advanced work, then you would definitely want to be reading the Nicomachean Ethics. But for our purposes, we can learn the basics without reading lots of Aristotle. So one of the big questions when we're thinking about like being a virtuous person is what virtues should we have? And you can see all sorts of lists on the internet of different virtues that different people recommend. And if you go to virtues list, for example, they have a lot of different virtues, some of which don't really seem like virtues at all, like beauty. I mean, is beauty a virtue? Seems like beauty is about how you look. It's not, so I mean, it's nice to be beautiful, sure, but virtue is not a moral virtue. Maybe it's an aesthetic virtue. If we can make a distinction between moral virtues and aesthetic virtues, and we admire aesthetic virtues, so maybe we want to make that distinction. And then there's other stuff which is like, the virtues list has virtues like joyfulness. Like, well, I guess that I mean, it's a slightly surprising one, being joyful. And maybe it's a good thing to be joyful. Exactly, is that really a great virtue? Maybe it is. It's a little hard to tell. The virtues list also lists unity. It's like, well, what's that? What's disunity? Like it's a bit vague. And then they have other, as you'll see here, like there's other things they list, which again is sort of a virtue, like cleanliness. I mean, it is good to be clean. Is that a moral virtue? Does it make you a better person to be clean? Is it like a moral failing if you don't wash enough? It's like, I mean, I'm not really sure. Like, well, it seems like it's kind of, but it's not. Uh, that's not one of the Ten Commandments. Wash daily. It seems like it's like something else. Yeah. Well, the virtues list is up now. It's like some website has listed cleanliness as a virtue. So maybe, I mean, we can talk about cleanliness of the soul. That's possible. Um, but I don't. I think generally this is the virtue list is talking about being kind of like having clean nails and stuff like that. So, I mean, I'm not recommending the virtues list as being a great list to you. What I am saying is like different people come up with different lists, and then you want to know, well, is there a right list? What list should we really be thinking about? So, back in the ancient times, we can definitely think of different lists apart from the one that Aristotle came up with. Uh, so one that definitely comes to mind is the Homeric virtues. So if you look at Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey, you get their big heroes, and they are portrayed as the people we should really admire. People like Achilles. Um, so, what are their kind of great virtues? Well, they were what the ancient Greeks admired was being born into a noble family, being wealthy, being physically strong, being good at battle, and that includes being good at killing people, and honor. Honor seems to be a pretty vague idea, but for the ancient Greeks, it especially meant that you had other people's respect. Again, I mean, you had a bunch of material goods, and you had a power over inferiors. Often it would include having lots of slaves. Uh, Another figure in Homer, especially the Odyssey, is the figure of Odysseus, also known as Ulysses. Uh, Odysseus is especially known for his cunning, being kind of like smart at deceiving people. In the Odyssey, one of the big stories is how Odysseus deceives the Cyclops. Uh, One of the first things that Odysseus tells the Cyclops when he asks his name, he says, "My name is nobody." Then later on in the story, when after Odysseus has blinded uh, the Cyclops goes around saying, "Nobody has blinded me." And so then people say, "Well, oh, that's good. Nobody has blinded you. So no need to worry then." So this is a kind of cunning thing, and Odysseus is well known for his kind of his cunning. I'm not sure whether we really are we really kind of big admirers of cunning and being good deceivers of people. It's like, well, again, it's like, well, is that I'm not sure that's the greatest thing, but it's an interesting perspective. Obviously, also we might think of the Christian virtues, and people like Thomas Aquinas would have a list like prudence, justice, temperance, and courage, as kind of they call those the cardinal virtues. And then they also include the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Uh, So those virtues are kind of interesting lists too. Um, Again, you can like you may wonder whether they speak to us in kind of present times. Uh, I guess the idea of being prudent, of being kind of careful, and planning ahead seems a good idea. Temperance, what they mean by that is kind of not going to any extremes, having a kind of moderate approach to life. And that seems something that we might kind of think is good. Justice is to do with fairness, and courage definitely seems important. We might also wonder whether like that list of 7 virtues is enough to tell you everything about how to live. It seems like a fairly short list. And you may kind of, if you're thinking about different moral dilemmas, you may think, well, those virtues are not necessarily the kind of most useful list, you might want to have other lists. So there's going to be a question about which virtue should we be kind of thinking about. As I mentioned, Aristotle is kind of the big name in virtue ethics. And a lot of people keep on going back to Aristotle as the main person to kind of think about. So, obviously, he was writing nearly 2,500 years ago. So, certainly, even if he's a very important philosopher, you may also wonder, is somebody who's writing 2,500 years ago going to give us a list of virtues which is relevant today? That's definitely going to be one of the first things that you think about. Here's a list of the virtues that he talks about. And one thing you'll see is that how they get explained. So in this list, you see there's the area of life or emotion. That's on the left-hand side. And then there's two extremes of kind of behavior or traits. And then for Aristotle, the virtue is the mean or middle between them. Right? So on Aristotle's view, a virtue is always a middle between two extremes. There's the deficit and the excess, and the virtue is kind of in between them. So courage is often like the most important one. Certainly, it's a virtue. I think we often think is a pretty important one today, so it's between rashness and cowardice, and it's to do with the kind of the realm of fear and confidence. That makes a lot of sense. Other ones in this list are kind of you look at this list and you think, well, that's an interesting list. So he's certainly interested in like the area of conversation, for example. And he says, if you're in conversation, there are two extremes. There's being kind of really dry or boring at one extreme, and then there's like playing a kind of fool, being a clown at the other extreme. And he says, well, no, you don't want to do either of those extremes. You want to like be witty. Again, it's an interesting that Aristotle includes this as a moral virtue, right? So being having a sense of humor is that he thinks is a moral virtue. Well, that's certainly an interesting perspective. All right, so then other kind of realms, yeah. Mean means kind of average, right? So it's like in like a sort of a mathematical sense, you talk about the mean of a set of numbers. A mean is an average. So it's like a kind of a middle way. Although one thing Aristotle says is like if you look at the two extremes, the middle is not always halfway between the two extremes. Sometimes the mean, the ideal, is kind of closer to one extreme than another. So with courage, he says, being courageous is much closer to rashness than it is to cowardice. So if you excess is like when you go into the extreme. So in terms of rashness, so we say with rashness is like if suppose you're on a battlefield and you're a regular soldier, is it a good idea just to choose the biggest, most destructive person on the other army and go straight for them? Well, that'd be pretty stupid because they're just going to kill you. So that would be just totally rash. Being courageous on the battlefield doesn't mean just doing something which means you're going to get yourself immediately killed. That's just stupid. So you should be, in terms of being courageous, you should kind of be careful about how you behave. So you're not stupid, but you also do something which is going to really benefit your side. So the excess is going too far. And then the deficit is like being cowardly is mean you just run away. Right? So courage, I think, is a good one to think about. The mean is not necessarily halfway between rashness and cowardice. You're going to have to take a lot of risks to be if you're being courageous, but you don't want to take so many risks that you just completely defeat whatever you're doing. So yeah, courage is an interesting one thing. Then in terms of social conduct, Aristotle thinks that being friendly is very important, and being friendly, but also like being able to make friends. In some ways, I'm not sure friendliness is necessarily the best translation. It's like having the capacity to make friends. But friendliness is part of that, right? Being good at social interactions. So he thinks the two extremes of that. On one hand, there's being obsequious. I guess one more contemporary phrasing of being obsequious is being a brown nose, just like kind of doing everything you can to please somebody else. And then the deficit for that is just being cantankerous, being angry, being very irritable, being somebody nobody wants to be around. Right. So he thinks friendliness is very important in social settings, and it's important in terms of being a good citizen. And that's an idea we're going to come up with. One thing you'll see about this is that he definitely thinks that emotions are very important, right? So you'll see there's a realm of anger. So like some philosophers seem to say that you should never be angry. You should never have any emotions. Certainly, you shouldn't do anything just out of anger. Kant, for example, seems to think you should just be totally rational. Aristotle kind of thinks, well, now anger is going to be totally appropriate sometimes. Being a good person is going to involve being angry sometimes. Now, you can go to an extreme. If you're just angry all the time, that's not good. But if you like are never angry, then he thinks that is like a lack of spirit. That means like you're just like you're just not really showing any sort of emotional strength at all. So he thinks that there are going to be times, and most of the time you should be patient, but sometimes it's going to be appropriate to lose your patience and to be angry with people if they deserve it. Right? So he thinks like the anger is going to be totally appropriate. He thinks that there's a realm of honor and dishonor. And certainly he thinks in terms of your own honor, sometimes it's going to be good to have a lot of pride and to have a lot of ambition and to try to achieve what you can. So he thinks it can be good to be proud of yourself and to aim to do a lot in the world. Then there's this idea of magnanimity, which is like being generous to others. And he thinks like that's a good thing. It can be kind of, if you an extreme, he thinks is kind of vanity, where you think you're just a wonderful person and there's nothing else counts. And I guess this in this table, pusillanimity, another hard word for me to say, is kind of like being sort of, I think it means being totally down on yourself, like always being kind of like humble about everything. There is an interesting divergence between Aristotle's ideas and some ideas you get in Christianity. which say that humility is really important. Definitely, Aristotle doesn't think you should always be humble. He thinks that it's good to have a lot of pride. Right? So that doesn't and that sort of kind of fits with the kind of the Greek ideas. As I mentioned previously, the Greeks really liked their Greek heroes, and certainly they had a huge amount of pride. Aristotle's not necessarily saying you should go that far, but you should have a fair amount of pride. Somebody who thinks there's stuff like righteous indignation, he thinks that's perfectly good. He thinks some modesty is good, but you shouldn't be too shy, but you shouldn't be totally shameless. And in terms of spending, you shouldn't give all your money away, but you should be generous. And you definitely shouldn't be mean. So in some ways, now, even though this is 2,500 years ago, you can think, well, all of this still makes a lot of sense, right? You don't look at this list and think, I have no idea what he's talking about. You think, yeah, I can relate to this. So, it's an interesting list. Again, you might think, well, is this going to help us solve all our moral problems? That's not so clear, but certainly it's an interesting list. All right, so a huge part of Aristotle's whole justification is that he thinks that individuals are part of a community. For Hame, he talked about the polis, which is like the city-state. He lived some of his life in Athens, and Athens we think of as the main sort of city-state. Athens was probably around 300,000 people. They're kind of it's not as if we have any clear indication of how many people. 300,000 people is like I guess it's a good-sized town in the United States. So certainly it's not a small village, right? It's a pretty big place, and he definitely thinks like people in that polis, everybody's going to have a sort of role, and everybody will play their role in that society. So he thinks it's very important for people to develop their character. He doesn't think that we're naturally good. He thinks that you have to work on your character. Also, a big part of virtue ethics is that parents have to bring up their kids. Now, back in ancient Athens, it's different from 21st century United States. It's very patriarchal, but still both parents would have some role in bringing up their kids. And he thinks like you have to bring up your kid well to give them a good character. As we were talking about, he thinks we should aim at a mean between extremes when you're learning how to be a good person, to have a good character. So this idea of community and your role in the community is extremely important. In some ways, it's a very sort of biological idea, and there's a sort of analogy of a beehive or an ant colony. Right? In an ant colony, you have different kinds of ants, and they have different roles. And for the colony to thrive, the ants have to kind of do their job well. Each kind of ant has a different sort of job. And so similarly, for the polis, for the city-state, different humans have to do their job well. So Aristotle has this kind of very sort of teleological view of human nature that people have to be performing their role in society. And in some ways, he thinks that your role in society is pretty much predetermined. Right. So, and that's an idea which kind of certainly fits with old approaches to thinking about your role in life. One way that people used to think is that, if you were a carpenter's son, then you should grow up to be a carpenter. You learn your dad's trade, and you take your role in life. If your dad was in the military, then you go into the military. If your dad was a leader, you go into being a politician. So obviously back in this era, women's main role was to be a mother and to look after their family and to be a sexual partner to their husband. Right? So there's clearly a very strong division of the sexes, and that's a very old school view. So there is this kind of idea that people have sort of set roles in society. These days, we have a much more fluid view, and you think, well, you can choose what you want to be. That's not so much an idea that was popular then. Although, in some ways, I think we should be a little careful about that contrast because, I mean, Aristotle himself, he was born in northern Greece. He left home around the age of 17. He traveled down to Athens. He studied with Plato. So, in some ways, he did a lot to determine his own life. After he left Athens, he was a tutor to Alexander the Great. So he also didn't just live in one place for the whole of his life. He moved around. So that will help us kind of think, well, actually, back then, maybe some people lived in the same place their whole lives and didn't kind of change. But probably there was a good amount of flexibility even back then. So we should not necessarily make too many assumptions about kind of how things were all just old school back then. Maybe things were actually not that different from our lives in some ways. Right. So one of Aristotle's main ideas is that if you live your life well, then your life will go well. So if you have a good character, then you will kind of flourish and basically, if you live as you're intended to live, then you'll do really well. Whereas if you sort of mess up, then you're not going to flourish so much. And he thinks, so leading a happy life is very much connected with this idea of flourishing. So he doesn't think you should aim to kind of like make yourself as happy as possible as your primary role. Your primary role should be to fulfill your responsibilities from your role. But if you do that, then you'll get the benefit of being happy. So the happiness is sort of like a side effect of how you behave. In order to be happy, you have to develop your virtues, and that takes practice. One thing that Aristotle talks quite a lot about is how we are quite liable to mess up. Humans are typically good at messing up. We are subject to temptation. We have all these emotions, and sometimes we don't do the right thing. So he thinks that we should aim to really kind of work on our characters, and then eventually, as you kind of get to the being in the right place, then you will able to lead a happy life. Now, you'll have noticed, like with the ancient Greek idea of the heroic virtues, one of the kind of things that they say, well, in order to be virtuous, you have to be wealthy. Well, not everybody's wealthy. So there is that. It seems like the ancient Greeks and for Aristotle too, they thought that some people just can never be virtuous because they're not born into the right sort of family, they're not born into the right sort of circumstances, and so they're never really going to be able to thrive, and that's just too bad. So in some ways, it seems like Aristotle and a lot of the ancient Greeks were sort of like saying that virtue only applies to a small portion of the population, and everybody else is kind of doesn't really get there. uh, that kind of idea, I think, is maybe a little shocking to us these days. I mean, these days we think, well, everybody can have a good life. But for the ancient Greeks, it was like, no, you have to be kind of born into the right circumstances, and some people are not going to have that. All right. So so far I've talked about Aristotle, and certainly, as I mentioned, he is sort of the central figure. But certainly, other philosophers had different views, and one thing to kind of highlight is that uh, they disagreed with Aristotle about the idea that only some people can be virtuous. So both Plato and later on the Stoics said that you don't have to have these kind of external goods. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be born into a good family in order to be virtuous and happy. You can actually achieve happiness on your own. So that's a big debate within virtue ethics, like whether happiness and virtue is something that only a small portion of the population can hope to achieve, or whether it's something that everybody can hope to achieve. And I guess, I mean, these days, we live in a democratic nation, or at least we hope we do, and we believe in the ideas of moral equality, but it's pretty clear that Aristotle, at least, didn't believe in moral equality. He thought that some people basically are better than others. As I already kind of highlighted, uh, one thing that's very interesting and distinctive about Aristotle's view in virtue ethics generally is that it does pay a good deal of attention to emotion. And it thinks that being a moral person is partly, having the right character is partly about what emotions you have or are liable to have. And so he thinks that take the idea of honesty and dishonesty. To be a good person, you have to kind of like love honesty, and you have to kind of hate dishonesty. So like you sort of have to be disgusted by dishonest people. Like, so if you encounter a liar, it's not just like, oh, I disagree with that. You have to kind of feel like, I hate that. There's like a kind of, it's part of your character to kind of love honesty and hate dishonesty. And if you act badly, it's not just that you should recognize you act badly, you should feel guilty. Guilt, I think guilt is certainly very close. I mean, feeling guilty is definitely an emotion. Maybe guilt is slightly different from an emotion, but it's very close to being an emotion. So the idea of virtue ethics is that in developing the right character, you really have to kind of have the right set of dispositions in terms of your emotions. You're going to like love some things, and you're going to hate others. You're going to feel guilt. These days, one thing that we might really prize in virtue, although this is not something that Aristotle really talked about directly, at least, is the idea of empathy and compassion. So one formulation of the idea of empathy is that if somebody else is hurting, then you will kind of feel their pain. You will like have that kind of emotional response that will sort of resonate with the other person. And so we might think from taking Aristotle's basic ideas, but kind of extending it to a modern approach, we might want to say, oh yeah, like a virtuous person is going to have a lot of compassion for others, is going to have a lot of empathy for others, is going to have an emotional response to the suffering of others. Right? So it's not just a matter of like making moral judgments or being able to make the right judgment. It's about having the right emotional responses to the circumstances you're in. All right. So Also, I get a big part of this is like, you have your responses for the right reasons. So definitely a virtuous person is not just trying to make themselves happy. A virtuous person is genuinely caring about other people. Right? So uh, if you don't care about other people, if you're just sort of manipulating other people, well, then that's not really being virtuous. You have to do things for the right reasons. Right. So a lot of that makes a lot of sense to us these days. Aristotle makes a distinction between ethical virtues and other virtues, and particularly the intellectual virtues. So he says, like, there's the virtue of theoretical reasoning and practical reasoning, and then there's ethical virtues of stuff like we've already talked about, like temperance and courage. And as I mentioned, he devotes quite a lot of his thought to thinking about how do people mess up? How do people fail to exhibit virtues? And how do people manage to be weak? And so he's interested in the idea of understanding those things and then working out how they can overcome those flaws. All right. So in some ways, up to now, I've kind of portrayed Aristotle pretty sympathetically. Right? But I think what we do have to kind of bear in mind that he was in a patriarchy, in a slave-owning patriarchy, and he defended that. Right. So it wasn't like he was just like kind of going along with it. He defended these views. Uh, so there's going to be a question about, well, how to deal with that when we're thinking about Aristotle as somebody to teach us about morality. So notoriously, Aristotle declared that women are defective men. So he thinks like men are kind of like the ideal, and women are inherently defective. And so he thought that women's roles should be limited to having babies, raising kids, and being sexual partners. So obviously these days we think, well, that's completely unacceptable. And so I think he's just wrong about that. He also notoriously defended the idea that non-Greek people were more suited to being slaves than Greek people, and he thought it was perfectly good and right for the Greeks to go out there and conquer other nations and enslave them, because he thought uh, their lives were improved by being slaves. Because really, these other people were inferior to the Greeks, and therefore they would be better off as slaves. So he thought there were people who were natural slaves, and it was good for them to be slaves. Obviously, when we think about slavery in the United States, that's very kind of closely tied to ideas of racism, and especially kind of the slavery of Africans. Now, back in terms of the ancient Greeks, they didn't even have ideas of race in the same way. They certainly had ideas of different people, but they didn't necessarily have ideas of race. I think it's kind of complicated exactly how the ancient ideas of different peoples and their inferiority kind of fits in with ideas of racism. In some ways, there's some sort of similarity, but they're not. There's a different idea. So it's a kind of complicated project to unravel that. But I mean, from our point of view at this stage, we can just look at it and think, well, that's Aristotle's idea is problematic. The idea that the Greeks are the best and everybody else is inferior, that's problematic. Now, there's other kind of things that we should also bear in mind, which are going to be sort of mentioning already. In some ways, Aristotle also believes in the nobility and the other classes. So even among like the men, uh, the Greek men, there are different levels of nobility. And he thinks that it's really only the most noble Greeks who are truly capable of being virtuous. So Aristotle thinks that you have to have goods such as friends, wealth, and power in order to be noble, and in order to be virtuous. Again, that seems kind of, from our point of view, that seems problematic. So certainly it seems like his view is like even among the Greeks, the lower classes and women can't really be virtuous and can't really be happy. So then there's a question about, well, how do we kind of respond to that? And we might think, well, you can just take Aristotle's basic ideas and then erase all his sexism and his classism and his racism, or whatever we want to call that, and kind of just say, well, his views are we can be adapted to the modern world. Maybe they can, but I don't think we should necessarily just assume that it's going to all go well in terms of that sort of change. We have to be worried to what extent his views may depend on this idea of some people are not really going to be capable of being virtuous. So that's a sort of big question. Let's think about another thing, which is a big, which I sort of mentioned already to some extent, this idea that your virtues are related to one's role in the community. Aristotle, as I mentioned, Aristotle didn't just have one community, he moved around. The Greek soldiers moved around a lot under Alexander the Great. They moved halfway around the world. So, and certainly they weren't just in one physical community. I think it's interesting. I think that the armed services are sort of interesting in terms of, you may think, well, actually, if you're in the army, then it's the army which gives you your community, right? Like the army itself is like your buddies, your squadron, whatever it is, that's your community. So you might say community is not necessarily one thing which is always physically in the same place. It can be like your group of people, and they can move around. Definitely, there's certainly plenty of migration. And partly because like the ancient Greeks were going around and like conquering people and then moving them around to different places. If you went to ancient Athens, it would be quite a multicultural place because of all the different people they'd enslaved. And it seems like in the ancient times there was a good deal of moving around. It's tempting to think, well, a community is just something that's defined by one culture, but probably there was kind of a fair amount of kind of cultural mixing even back then. So there's a big question about, what do we mean by our community? And then you can think about, well, how does this apply to the modern world, right? I mean, like, so ancient Athens, 300,000 people. Now, what about New York City? 8-9 million people. And then there's Long Island, and kind of the other, New Jersey. If you grow up in New York City, well, what's your community? Is it the place you were born in? People move around a lot. Is it like your church? Well, I mean, not everybody has a church. And people maybe have complicated relationships with their church. Is it like your neighbors? I mean, a lot of the time people don't even talk to their neighbors. So on Long Island, it seems like one way of thinking about things is like that good fences make good neighbors. You actually want to have like good solid barriers between you and your neighbor. You don't like, you don't want to really be like kind of I mean, you can be friendly with your neighbor, you have them around for a barbecue every now and then, but that doesn't mean like they're part of your community in some definite way. So I mean, I think these days there's a big question about, well, if you say, oh, people identify with your community, well, what community? Uh, and I guess maybe that's especially true in New York City, where you have so many immigrants, because immigrant. Then, if you think about an immigrant community, it's like, well, where's your community? Is it like back in your old country? Is it here? Kind of the whole idea of community is sort of somewhat flexible. So, since Aristotle's whole idea is that your virtues depend on your role in the community, it becomes pretty hard to think about what is my role in the community, what is my community. That's all a bit up in the air. So I think that makes it hard to think about virtue ethics uh, in a very clear way. All right. So Aristotle kind of says that this idea. Think that kind of, your culture kind of creates what virtues you should have. Uh, now, it seems like his view is like may be applicable to ancient Greece. But then you think, well, what kind of ideas do we want to have uh, for the modern world, and do we want to think about a different set of virtues in the modern world? Uh, I mentioned at the start, there's all sorts of different lists of virtues. And so then it's like, well, which virtue should we really be focusing on? Um, to what extent is Aristotle's approach really something we can extend to the modern world? I think that's a kind of a question that is left open. Um, so I think that's kind of a big question. Yeah, I mean, I would say that these days, I mean, say, suppose you're a university student. Does that mean that the university is your community? Do you want to become a university student? Do you have a whole different set of moral responsibilities as a member of the university? Do you care about your fellow students? How do you feel about it? Yeah. Mhm. Well, say that again. No, we're not talking about we're not talking about legal stuff here. We're talking about morality. What are your moral responsibilities as you enter a place like St. John's? Does that change your moral responsibilities? And you see, like, well, I think I haven't really met many St. John's students who say, "Oh yeah, I totally identify with my university, and this gives me a whole different set of moral responsibilities." Um, so so then, like, well, so then the question is like, to what extent does our responsibilities change depending on our context? Um, Well, we're going to be talking a little bit about, I'll talk a little about relativism soon. I mean, one way to think about it is that, um, as a member of a kind of community, your parents come from a sort of tradition and they hand on their values to you, and then you adopt your parents' values. That's one sort of way of thinking about values and character. Your parents have had some role in creating your character. Uh, I mean, maybe your parents like to think that they made you who you were. Um, I mean, well, when I think about my parents, I think, well, in some ways you did, but some ways I actually kind of fought hard to try and escape your influences, right? So like, I don't necessarily think that my parents were the ones who like made me the person I was. Uh, so I mean, there's a question about like to what extent your community is formed by your family or your sort of his history, your family's history. It all just seems like very vague. So the idea that you can like say, oh, your community gives you your values and tells you what to do, I think is very tricky these days. I mean, certainly, I mentioned the idea like, oh. My dad was a carpenter, so I'm going to be a carpenter. But how often does that happen? I mean, it seems like that's a very old school idea, which is not really very applicable these days. Uh, it's pretty rare for people to say, "Oh, we have a family business. I'm just going to go into the family business." That's not how things operate. Uh, these days, it seems like we decide how we're going to live our lives. Now, you have hopes, or you sort of fall into something. I mean, some people are very sort of self-directed, and they say, they know from an early age what they're going to do in their life. But other people, like, you have a bunch of jobs, and you think, oh, this is kind of working out, and I'll try and follow this. It's kind of life is sort of accidental rather than just being kind of like something planned out. So this idea that you just get your values from your community or from your role in life, like life seems much more haphazard than that, right? Seems like Aristotle's view is like there's a sort of the world has an order to it, and you just fit into that order. I think most people's experience of life these days is like life is kind of random. So it doesn't seem like that kind of idea of an ordered life makes a lot of sense. So I've been talking a lot about Aristotle. Uh, there are these other philosophers who have more recent philosophers who have defended virtue ethics in recent decades. So here's a list of Rosalind Hursthouse, Alistair MacIntyre, Philippa Foot, Julia Annis, Christine Swanton. These are all Philippa Foot is deceased, but I think all those others are still actively working. Alistair MacIntyre is in his 90s now, but he's still busy defending a view. So there's a big question for modern virtue ethics, like, well, how do we kind of think about our role in the world? And I mean, do we want to think of ourselves not as a role in like somebody in Queens or New York City or the United States? Maybe you get your role from being a global citizen or from being just a human. That might be one way to think about it to make it more universal. Although, if I think about what's my role as a human, like, I mean, that I don't really feel like I have a lot of connection with humanity as such. I just have connections with people I know in my life. So there's big questions about that. And certainly, if you are really interested in virtue ethics, these are some of the big names who are kind of defending versions of virtue ethics. Most of them still kind of are big fans of Aristotle and say you can adapt Aristotle's views and kind of make them more plausible and relevant to the contemporary world. Now, one thing that seems like you might want to kind of think about is the idea that you can make more sense of virtue ethics if you think about like small societies and each small society has its own different values. And so that's certainly one of the ideas you get in relativism. Like the different societies have different values, different religions have different values. And so maybe if you have a kind of small society, everybody has their role in that society, then different societies have a whole bunch of different values. And then we can just say values are just relative to what society you're born into. And certainly, I mean, thinking about the way that Aristotle seemed to put it, it does seem to open the door to that kind of relativism. The idea that uh, maybe we can get our values from our societies, but different societies are going to have different values. Most virtue ethicists tend to resist that, and they say, oh no, we can come up with a list of fundamental values which everybody should have, no matter which society you're in. So I think there's a sort of tension there between like your local values and your kind of more universal values. And I think one of the reasons that virtue ethicists want to resist relativism is that if you once you start going down the road of relativism and saying, well, it's just different from different people, then you sort of end up with a view that anything goes, anybody can have any set of values. Because like, you know, what values do you have? Well, whatever values I feel like having now. That's the worry about relativism, that it just seems to open the door to everything being just completely subjective. And people don't really like the idea that values are just subjective. They like the idea that you know, we can have something solid. So we'll be talking about whether we can come up with sort of universal human values. One thing we'll be looking at is evolution, and we've already mentioned this a little bit. Maybe every human society has to have certain kind of values in order for it to be successful. Like humans are very social creatures, and societies have to have certain values just in order to be able to not disintegrate. And maybe in similar ways to like an ant colony. Maybe so we might be going back to that kind of biological idea. And maybe evolutionary psychology can point to the values that every society should have. And basically the idea is like we should be willing to make sacrifices for the whole. And we should be willing to kind of do things which will be good for the whole of the community. So maybe we can look at some evolutionary psychology as a clue to maybe some sort of fundamental values that apply to all humans. So that's a possibility. All right, so at various points already, I've been like kind of looking at like the list of values and saying, well, they seem great. One question is like, well, suppose that you want to be courageous and temperate and just, and so yeah, that's a great set of values. Now I ask you a moral problem, such as say, is physician-assisted suicide morally right? Well, okay, so you should be courageous and just and temperate and prudent. So, well, is that going to tell you what to do about how to think about physician-assisted suicide? Doesn't seem like it is going to tell you much. Now, it seems like one thing we started off with is like, oh, like if you're a wise person, if you have the right character, then you'll just know the right answer. Like, well, maybe, but that seems quite a prediction. Like, and one thing we've noticed is like there are all sorts of people who seem to be wise, and they come up with very different answers about the same problems. So can we really is it maybe there's something good about virtue ethics, but we might worry that it doesn't actually give us all the right answers. I mean, there are some things that Aristotle was willing to say and seem to be pretty applicable. Aristotle said adultery is wrong. And he thinks like a good person would know that. And you know, it seems like, yeah, so maybe there are some ways in which virtue ethics can tell us how to live. But there's a big question about how much you can extend it to all moral problems. All right. So it definitely seems like even if you start out with the virtues, you're not going to be able to like just crank out the right answers to moral problems. Now, uh, maybe that's not really a deficit of virtue ethics. Maybe we should just say, well, that's how morality is. Like that, there's going to be a lot of room for interpretation, and people are going to disagree, but we can still have ideas about who's morally good, and that's what's important. So maybe we shouldn't kind of expect morality to, or our moral theory to kind of be. You can't be just like a machine where you crank out the right answer. Maybe that's just a ridiculous way to think about morality. So that's a sort of that takes us to step back and think, what do we expect from our moral theory? You know, shouldn't maybe we should just not expect too much. Maybe we should just expect it's just going to give us some general guidelines, and that's enough. Certainly if you compare it with utilitarianism or like the list of duties, say for that Ross advocated, it seems a little less specific. But even those views are pretty vague. So maybe virtue ethics isn't actually doing a lot worse than those other theories. So maybe it's not a huge problem. All right. Another sort of question is like, to what extent is virtue ethics able to give us political answers? So it gives us the list of virtues. They seem like very personal things, right? They seem like about how an individual should behave, how an individual should develop his or her character. But you know, if you want to think about a general political issue, um, then it's like, well, what's virtue ethics going to tell us about that? It seems like it's much more focused on how an individual should live rather than what a government should do, what the role of government should do. So it may be that virtue ethics is kind of a little bit somewhat restricted, while utilitarianism especially seems pretty well adaptable to governments. In some ways, maybe we think, yeah, governments should definitely be maximizing the overall welfare of society. That's a good thing that utilitarianism says. Virtue ethics may be better as a guide to individual living rather than how government should behave. Certainly Aristotle had his own politics, and he set that out in a different work. He didn't think that his virtue ethics would be able to tell us how we should run our government. So he thought those were totally sort of separate issues. All right, so let's kind of end. We're not ending right now, but think about particular moral issues. Let's think about factory farming, abortion, and punishment. And what does virtue ethics have to say about those things? Well, obviously, it's going to depend a lot on whatever list of virtues you think are the right virtues. So as I was just saying, Aristotle doesn't necessarily think that your virtues are going to tell you what you should do. So if you want to think about like whether or not abortion is morally right, it's not clear that the list of virtues by themselves really tells you what to think about that. Or factory farming, do those virtues tell us what attitude we should have to non-humans? What about punishment? It's like again, it's not clear. So let's think about these issues just briefly, at least. Obviously, back in Aristotle's days, there weren't any factory farms. There was lots of farming. Now, I don't think, as far as I know, Aristotle never wrote anything which gave any indication that he cared about animal welfare, right? So it seems like that just really wasn't on his radar at all. certainly, I mean, back in those times, the idea that we should be vegetarians, like, well, that that probably wouldn't be something that he would have been in favor of, partly because he has this teleological view that presumably he thinks that animals are here to serve people, to feed us. Right? That's a very common view in a lot of societies, that the role of animals is to feed humans. Obviously, particularly animals like chickens, cows, and pigs. I'm not exactly sure which farm animals are actually really popular back in ancient Greece. So it's a part, sort of like an archaeological question: what animals did they raise? I mean, presumably they had lots of horses, but I don't think they ate horses. Right? So horses had a different role. Uh, right. So yeah, I mean, you might worry, or you might think, well, Aristotle, if you take an Aristotelian perspective, you could definitely think about factory farming and the effect of factory farming on society. You might think, like, you might worry about, in terms of the environmental costs of factory farming, that you might think, well, that's bad for society. So that you might be able to kind of think about those things in some ways, but it doesn't clearly he's going to have a whole lot to say about that. What about abortion? Again, there's no indication that Aristotle thought that a fetus had any value. It's not something he wrote about at all. As I've mentioned a whole bunch of times, ancient Greece was a patriarchy, so he definitely is not going to believe in anything like women's rights. That would be completely alien to him. And so I think. I guess one thing that obviously is very important in a patriarchal view is that a man should be able to uh, have in male heirs, and so probably that sort of patriarchal view is not going to be sympathetic to the idea that women should be able to have an abortion because that could deprive a man of his male heirs. So that would certainly be kind of something the Aristotelians would be against. Uh, but on the other hand, there might be cases where a man doesn't want, if a man gets a woman pregnant, he might think, well, this could be awkward, especially if the woman is not his wife. What if he got a slave pregnant, for example? Then he might insist that you have an abortion. Obviously, part of the issue is the reason the abortion issue is different is that they certainly did not have medical abortion back then, although they did have herbs and other ways to try and for a woman to induce miscarriage. And there have been plenty of ways over the years that women have had to try and make themselves have a miscarriage. Classically stuff like throwing yourself down the stairs or kind of hitting yourself in the stomach, those sorts of horrific kind of things. And also there are some natural herbs have a reputation for inducing abortions, spontaneous miscarriages. So it's not something that was completely unknown in Aristotle's time. So, and in terms of virtue ethics, it's not clear how the virtue ethics are going to apply to kind of the case of abortion. So it just seems like it's not clear that those kind of virtue ethics are going to tell us a whole lot about what to think about abortion. I mean, there are virtue ethicists, especially Rosalind Hursthouse, who is focused on the issue of abortion, and she has, at least in some moderate way, argued in favor of women's right to have an abortion. So there are modern virtue ethicists who think that you can apply virtue ethics to abortion, but you can have to do quite a lot of work in order to kind of make that a convincing argument. Finally, let's think about the issue of punishment and why you should kind of punish people. or what kind of level of punishment you should think about. Is the death penalty justified? Stuff like that. Now, certainly the Aristotle and just about everybody else says, oh, we should be just. That's pretty vague. You should be just. What does that mean, be just? You believe in justice? It doesn't seem to kind of give us a lot of answers. As I say here in the slide, the Athenians imposed fines, imprisonment, and a set time of public humiliation in the stocks, a limited loss of political rights, total disenfranchisement or exile from the city, which could be amplified with the confiscation of property or the razing, which means the burning of the convict's house, and death. So they had all sorts of punishments in ancient Athens, and they believed in those punishments. So presumably Aristotle would kind of go along with those sorts of ideas. But as I said, just looking at virtue ethics itself and its general ideas of kind of the virtues, I think the best thing you could say is they would think about what's best for the polis, what's best for the community. Whatever punishment is going to be best for the community is the one that makes sense. So I think it's going to be a bit vague. So I think really going to really highlight the virtue ethics. It's kind of interesting, but it's kind of hard to really fill out as a giving us answers to the moral questions we want to kind of think about.